hold of the ELCA's document, but let me first start with some definitions that'll be important as we talk about this. So end-of-life choices, at least I think of these actually as starting before I become terminally ill. How many of you have a healthcare directive? That's awesome. Awesome, awesome. So, you know, in that directive, you cover all of these things. What kind of treatments do I want? What kind of interventions? What about nutrition? What about CPR? That's what you cover in healthcare declaration. That's the Minnesota term for it. Other states, it might be called an advanced directive. Really important to talk with your kids about it. Oh, you're pointing? Oh, yes, question.
Right here, right here.
Yes, I'm sorry. Cynthia. I'm sorry.
Your end-of-life decisions, I know at least for me, maybe it isn't true for everybody, they change from day to day between. In fact,
They do.
several years ago, I was very glad I didn't have an end-of-life decision because, well, it was 12 years ago now. The doctor sent me home. Well, he wanted to, the doctor wanted to send me home.
Oh,
Turn it on.
there you go.
The doctor wanted to send me home, you know, and basically give me some painkillers, and I
Okay.
would have died.
And you would have died.
But my daughter insisted, my son was willing to go along with that. He thought, well, that might be for the best.
Yeah,
But
okay.
I have had 12,
Good years.
well, I don't know if they were good years, but they were years when I feel like they were happy years
Yes,
for me.
yes, yes,
For me, not
yes.
necessarily for me else.
Yes.
So,
No, I think you raise a good point, which is something like a health care directive is something you want to update from time to time. And I think also when you think about the choices in it, one of the ways that my mother would think about it is what for me is quality of life at any point in my life. And maybe if I can sit in a chair and watch the Vikings at a stage in my life, you know, that's enough quality. But no, you're right. These things change over time. And so what you might have in a healthcare directive might change as you get older. And so keeping that up to date is really important. Yes?
One of the markers of when you might want to change is if there's a death in the family. If there's a death in the family, if there is a new diagnosis,
Thank you.
if there's a divorce.
Yes.
So those are at least 3 kind of markers that
Yes.
you should take a look at your healthcare directive.
Absolutely. Major life events like that. Yeah. That's a really good point, Chris. Thank you. Another document that my mother had up on her refrigerator is a do not resuscitate document, which is also really important because as we get older, CPR can break your ribs, can break all your ribs. It can be a really painful experience. And yet, if you don't have these instructions available to your healthcare providers, they may be required or compelled to do this. Yes?
Sometimes if you don't have the posted DNR order, if 911 is called, they have to
They
perform
have to.
CPR unless they can see that document.
Right. And that's why my mother had it posted on her refrigerator. That's where they look for it. So again, these are more than what is talked about by the ELCA. These are the very practical kinds of things. But sitting down with somebody who's very educated to really help you walk through these become important because someone may not be there to intervene when 911 responds and has to do CPR. Medical aid in dying. We'll talk about this more a little bit later, but just to point out, this is laws that now are present in 10 states and in the District of Columbia, and it allows, under very strict circumstances, a physician to prescribe medicine that once you take it will lead to your death. But we'll talk about that because it comes up. No, Minnesota is not in it. In Minnesota, legislation has been, this legislation, which it's essentially the same in every state where it exists, has been introduced now for a few years, but no, it hasn't passed. Oh. The other definitions that I have, I'll just mention so I'm going to be talking about a social message. You can go on the ELCA website and see all of these, including the one I'm going to talk about. And essentially, they represent the convictions of church leadership on that particular topic. ELCA memorials, this is the way that if I want a change in a social statement, I think this social statement needs changing. It was adopted in 1992. That's 30 years ago. A lot of things have changed. And I'll mention some of the things that I think need to be changed. Anybody can draft what's called a memorial, which is what I've done. And it requests the church. In this case, what I'm asking is, I think you should reconsider the current social message and revise it, update it. And the process is, it comes from a church, us. It goes to your conference assembly, which happens in February. It goes to the synod assembly, which is scheduled for May. And then if they pass it, it would go to the church-wide assembly and or the ELCA. And the church-wide assembly is in July, and our own Pastor Peter will be attending. So that's the process. So now I'm going to turn to the end-of-life document. As I mentioned, adopted in 1992. These are the sections I'm going to cover. It starts out, though, with sort of painting the picture. And painting the picture meaning that there's a person who's terminally ill in a difficult situation. And so it's in that context that this statement was developed, or this message was developed. You can go back to look at those. So the message starts with what I would call setting out what are the Christian principles or tenets are we thinking about as we then discuss what's morally acceptable in terms of our end-of-life choices. So yeah, life is God's gift, and we give thanks for that. But as I said earlier, life as God's gift does not mean that life is something that we want to continue under any circumstances. But it is God's gift. God also created the processes of our life. And that includes birth and death. So these are natural processes. They are all God's creation. Death is God's creation. There's a lot of emphasis in the social message, which I think is important, that as we live and as we die, these should happen in community. That's what it means in large part to be church, that we are in community as we live, as we celebrate, as we mark important milestones, and as we die. So that's often factored into the discussion in the social message, and I think it's really important. That was the thing my mother feared. She didn't fear death by any means, but she feared dying alone and in pain. And I think we all fear that. Now, I highlighted this because not only do I think it's important, but it's one of the arguments that I make for why the statement needs to be reconsidered. So, as Christians, we are to respect each person's agency. And in end of life, that means respecting their preferences in terms of treatment decisions. That's very clear in the statement. We all have agency. Our preferences should be respected, particularly if we state those preferences in a healthcare declaration or a healthcare directive, and then later our cognition changes and we are no longer able to restate those preferences, but we've documented them. Truthfulness and faithfulness in relationships are essential, including in the dying process. We need to be truthful with each other. And hope and meaning in life are possible even in time of suffering and adversity. However, that's not to suggest that we should extend that suffering or adversity because there can be hope and meaning in it. That's not, in my view, the implication. The idea that I'll continue living with painful terminal cancer because the church says there can be hope and meaning in that. That's not what this is saying. So, any questions about those fundamentals as the basis for then what the message talks about? So then there's a section in the message that says it's asking the question, what is morally acceptable given our Christian faith in terms of end of life? What are morally acceptable decisions and what are not? So the first issue it considers is withholding or withdrawing artificial nutrition and hydration. That's often a question, or it is a question in the healthcare directive. And essentially the church says, yeah, that's okay, that's morally acceptable. A patient can decide that that sort of treatment is too burdensome versus the benefits that they would receive by continuing that. Again, this is when artificial hydration and nutrition will extend your life, potentially for a very long time, but you have no expectation that you will ever become better, in effect. In those circumstances, the church says, if it's not going to improve or prevent death, yeah, even if your doctor or your family or other people want you to do this, you have the right to say no. And you have the right to state that in your healthcare directive so that this doesn't happen to you when you're no longer able to make that decision. Chris?
In my healthcare directive, I have written that I do not want to be force-fed.
Thank you.
So not artificial nutrition hydration, but just
intubation.
No,
just
spoon feeding.
Spoon
If you're
feeding.
in a care center
Thank
or
you.
assisted living, they will
They'll
just
spoon feed you.
keep pushing. You keep your mouth closed. They'll try to trick you to open it up. I mean, so
That's excellent point.
I just put, if I have dementia, I do not want, if I don't open my mouth, don't feed me.
Don't feed me. Thank
Yeah.
you. Very good suggestion. Yes.
It can be that hand feeding can be an artificial source of nutrition because it's not me feeding
Right.
myself.
It's not
so
me
it's
feeding myself.
artificial. So adding some terminology.
Yeah.
And state by state, it might be different how you have to name that. New York
Right.
State has some specific terminology you can use. And there's also now a term called VSED. It's voluntary cessation of eating and drinking. That's a way people can say, I don't want this anymore.
Absolutely.
And that's a part of their right to determine how
Absolutely.
their end-of-life process goes.
Yeah, for those of you who knew Steve Wolf, that's what he chose to do. He decided that at a certain point in time, depending on his condition, he would simply quit eating and drinking. That is entirely up to the patient and should be respected. My grandfather did the same thing. And they, he even told my dad, I'm not eating and drinking anymore. So you're right. Those are ways in which you can be really clear about hydration and nutrition. And it is a way that people choose to hasten death, although, I would argue it's still more painful than perhaps other options. But we'll get to that. The church also talks about refusal of beneficial treatment. And here they say, yes, if you are a competent person, and again, that's where the healthcare directive becomes important because you may become incompetent at some point, you may refuse treatment, even if it's recommended by the healthcare providers. My mother-in-law was on her third round of treating for esophagus cancer. She was done. Do not want this anymore. I want to go home. I want to enjoy, to the extent that I can, my last weeks. And her doctor said, no, you should continue. Her husband said, I want you to continue. And she was, no, I'm done. So, yeah, that's what the church is saying. This goes back to that point about respecting each individual and respecting their treatments. That's a Christian perspective, and this certainly reflects that. Now we get to what was then called physician-assisted death, what's now called medical aid in dying. And here, at least in 1992, the church said, we are opposed to physician-assisted death even if it's the patient's wish. And why is that? Why is that? Why is that? So the reason that the church says no, is because they say it's deliberately destroying life created in the image of God. Again, I'm just saying what the church's rationale is. They are against, the church is against they are against private killing of one person by another. And honestly, I don't think it's private killing, but I'll talk about that. And they're concerned about abuse. Okay, I get this. And they think that hospice offers more humane treatment. But let me talk a little bit now about medical aid in dying. And I'll be honest, I think it's an option we should be afforded. My mother was a big proponent of this. She supported an organization that works with states to move this legislation in place. First of all, it's been around for 40 years, and there's not a single substantiated accusation of abuse that has occurred. So there's no evidence of abuse, coercion, etc. Also, it can only be rendered if the person is competent at that time and able to administer the prescription. In other words, my father, who died of actually untreated prostate cancer, but was profoundly demented at the time that he died, which is why we chose not to treat the cancer, which was his wish. He would not have been able to avail himself of this because at the point of his death, he was not competent. 2 doctors have to certify that you will not live for any more than 6 months. 2 persons have to witness that. And in almost the vast majority of cases, this happens in the context of hospice. So hospice has already been brought in, and this happens at that point in time. I don't know if any of you remember Trudy Lone. She was our hospitality coordinator for a period of time. Anyway, one of the things that she does is she's present at medical aid in dying. She has, for example, we were in contact with her when she was helping this process of a cousin in California where it is legal. And she asserted what I've just described, that it would be extremely difficult for this to be used to sort of get rid of somebody that you don't want in your life, as an example, an elderly relative. Or somebody's just worn out. My friend who I talked about, Martin, he wasn't within that 6-month window. He would not have been able to use this. So its application is relatively limited, but my friend Anne, who was living in a lot of pain for about 3 weeks, she would have been able to use this if it was legal in Minnesota. Very few people actually use the medication. I think I read someplace where only 1% of people who have the prescription actually then administer it. But it's kind of peace of mind, would be my guess. So I personally think that if I am taking the medication myself and I'm competent, I'm not sure this is private killing of one person by another. And I don't know how it's that much different from aggressive palliative care, morphine and other kinds of medication that will hasten death. I mean, it's not quite like taking a drug, but it's certainly going to hasten death. And if you no longer have nutrition, whether you've decided not to eat or drink anymore, or you don't want artificial interventions, that will certainly hasten death. So it feels like a distinction without much of a difference. Anyway, yes, yes.
I got to be transparent. I'm a retired palliative care doc, but I didn't practice around here. These are excellent points that you're making. And the MAID, which I was not familiar with that terminology, originated in Oregon.
Yes, it did.
And there's very, very few people that use this because
That's right.
the doc makes a prescription for a whole bunch of barbiturates, and then you go to the pharmacist and wink, wink, what are you going to do with these, and be careful with them and all that. And so it's really got a lot of problems associated with it, and sounds scary, but may or may not become a practical issue. What is a practical issue is that the palliative care docs have the option of conscious sedation.
Yes.
And this is not morphine or painkillers, but it's other medications sort of in the Valium family that can be given IV with the understanding that there could be a double effect. And this probably will shorten your loved one's life. But they're in so much pain and the morphine's not working, and this is a bad situation with a lot of suffering that we're willing to accept that, and they basically go to sleep and pass away in a fairly short period of time. Now, I think the people in this room understand this, but this end-of-life stuff is such a difficult subject for the medical community, because what my job was to go in and try to reverse everything, because these docs, and especially these young docs, all they want to do is to not have you die on their shift. And so oncologists, surgeons, ID docs, ICU guys, pulmonologists, everybody except the psychiatrists and the palliative care docs have a real hard time with you refusing their treatment. And the average layperson has a hard time standing up for themselves, because I don't want to upset my oncologist. I like him or her so much that I don't want to I don't want to offend my doctor or the nurse practitioner. You're the boss of your own body.
You are.
That's the thing,
You
the
are.
mantra that you have to
You are.
you have to work uphill and sometimes really fight for your own rights. And the biggest
And the church says you have
absolutely. There's
it's
nothing
morally
wrong with it.
completely acceptable.
And the biggest thing that I tried, the two biggest hurdles I had was getting people to understand their diagnosis, because most had no idea. And the second thing is we needed to define the goals of care. And the goal of care with end of life is your comfort.
Correct.
And everybody's comfort is different.
That's
so
a good point, too.
what my comfort would be is different from your comfort. And some people want to, and I found this especially true in the Jewish faith, want everything done so that they have the maximum time on earth.
Yeah.
So if you're going to, and the one thing I didn't see on this ELCA thing was the use of a ventilator and assisted compassionate withdrawal from being on a breathing machine. with a
And
tube
those
down.
are the kinds of things that I think were
Yeah.
not as present
Yeah, we need
30
to-
years ago, and that's why this needs to be updated.
Yeah, because that coming off a ventilator is a tough go too, because
Yeah.
there's the vernacular of pulling the plug and all this stuff, and there's a way to do it comfortably. You sedate the patient, you make sure suction's there, you make sure the family's there. There's a whole really very reasonable way to do these things, but the physician assisted, the MAID thing probably isn't going to be a practical option. But for what it's worth, my 2 cents would be, when you get to a point in your life or your loved one's life that you don't want any therapy, get a palliative care doc or a palliative care team to help you. And remember, you're the boss of your own body. No matter what your grandkid says, and we always used to joke about this, a person from California coming in on a white horse that's going to save you, make sure you get your CPR. CPR, I've got a lot of things going through my brain. I don't want to take up too much time, but CPR is a horrible thing to go through. And if they can't shock you in the first 15 seconds of your heart stop, and you ain't going to make it. The survival rate for CPR in the hospital or with a chronic illness is less than 5%. And the ribs do break, and it's and in Wisconsin you have a wristband, and yet
You live
I
in
saw many
Wisconsin.
times when the wristband was ignored, and so you really got to get into a mode that I'm going to fight for my rights to be comfortable and have a good death, because I want a good death, she wants a good death,
course.
we all
We
want
all
a good
do.
death. But if you leave it up to your doctor, man,
The computer wants a good death.
you're going to get a
Yeah.
you're going to get a bad death. And
Yeah, I think so. So I would just
I
say,
would just say you got to fight for this.
yeah.
And can I just bring up one
Sure.
other thing? So another thing
course.
is that in terms of these, the moral and ethical thing, we're both doctors, so we're bashing our own profession, but I would also like to have compassion for the physicians. So when I was a resident, I was an obstetrician, and we had a young woman who was a Jehovah's Witness. She said, I do not want blood. And she was
Yeah,
bleeding to
yeah,
death
yeah,
in the delivery room,
yeah.
and one of our attendings gave her blood.
Oh,
And that was a huge lawsuit against the University of
Of
Iowa.
course.
Dr. Gopperud lost. The young woman lived, but
Right.
in her eyes. So
Yeah.
we all have to be, even when we totally disagree with the person's decision, it is
It's
their,
their
decision.
decision. Yeah, their
and that is
decision.
really hard.
Yeah.
But I would just say that's important. That's
So I would just say my own experience, and I'll pass this on to Rita, my own experience at the universe at Fairview with my mother, there was no pushback whatsoever from the doctors, none. So, but then it was very clear, there was no lack of clarity, and I was there, and as you can kind of tell, I can be a force of nature. So, what I said my mother wanted was going to be what we were doing. Yeah, so make sure you have an advocate if you want to hire me. Rita. Oh,
Also connecting the fact that I have a lot of medical connections, but going to some personal experiences with this. My mother is 94, and this all sounds really marvelous, except it doesn't work in a small town in Kansas.
okay. Okay.
Because
Why not?
she's in a nursing home, and they have very limited staffing abilities. There's continual turnover. I don't think that the people who care for her day to day have any concept of this stuff.
Okay.
It's
okay.
just not in their
It's not in their
experience. It's not in their training. It's not in.
And you
I
can't
don't
set
know
boundaries?
where I don't know where palliative care is available to her.
Okay, so that
So,
may not.
so when you talk about get a palliative care,
yeah,
that's
it may not
marvelous.
exist.
But
Okay.
reality is
Okay.
outside of a lot of big cities,
Yeah.
it's not there. I mean, we're struggling with the fact that a cook can walk off. I mean,
Sure,
the cook
sure,
for the nursing
sure.
home
Yeah.
can walk off on
Yeah,
a Friday
yeah.
night and just disappear.
Right.
And the head person of the nursing home has to come in and figure
You're
out
right.
how to feed
That's
60
a problem.
people.
That is a big problem.
It's a big problem.
It's a big problem.
And, we are well educated. She is still mentally mostly
right,
there.
right.
But post-polio has
Right.
paralyzed her from the
Yeah.
waist down. She can do nothing for herself.
Yeah.
I mean, she
Yeah.
can't turn over.
Yeah,
She can still feed herself and do
Sure.
things like that, and she would be happy to be gone.
of course.
But she's not really in pain. She's
Right.
not really
Right.
terminally
She's
ill.
not terminally ill.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
And this is with 6 children, 2 living
Right,
there, 2
right,
of us coming
right.
every month or 2, and we bring her food to,
of course.
to do everything
Right,
we can.
right.
But we can't be there at 2 o'clock in the morning
No.
when she doesn't get her diaper changed.
Well, and this is, I mean,
You know.
I'll just say, as a general matter, we as a society haven't yet figured out the best ways to let people die. And so I'm talking about what the church's statement is, and that even that needs some updating. But what you're talking about is, I think, a broader social issue. I mean, the fact that, if your mother does die, they'll take the body out the back, you know, sort of like we don't want to see dead bodies, as opposed to taking the body out the front with people lined up, you know, rejoicing. I mean, God is with us in life and death. So it's very painful for families, especially in situations that you're describing where the resources aren't there for some sort of alternative. Now, the last part of the social message is, again, talking about the importance of community for people in their last days. And you are providing your mother with that through the family. And maybe there are others in that small community. And certainly, as you complete that health care directive, I mean, just listening to people like Chris, who have a lot of experience with this, doing that with children, that's how we did it with my mother, walking her through it, really talking about what would this look like. So we were both very clear about what she wanted, and we could get into those nuances that you've been raising. Having more education about this. I mean, the church is a great place for that education to occur, but there have been great questions that I don't know the answer to, but you know, we have a palliative care doctor here, and we have a person experienced with hospice. So really helping us think through these questions. Pastors, of course, play an important role. We've been talking about this with the young docs wanting to keep people alive. What are we doing to help those organizations understand end of life differently and understand their role in that differently? Maybe the church has a role to play here as well. But the social statement talks about this, and again, really emphasizes the importance of community, and for these sorts of organizations to begin to think about end of life and practice end of life in a different way. So now we're going to talk about my memorial, and as I already mentioned, it is too long. It's like, apparently they're supposed to be all on one page, so I have to cut a page and some. Right, so what you do with the memorial is you set out what you want done. Okay, I want the church to look at its 1992 statement and reconsider it because I think it's out of date. So then you have to give some rationale. Well, first of all, I'm not the first. Another synod has already requested reconsideration, and they specifically refer to the medical aid and dying being out of date. Because there are lots of ways, as Jack was saying, there are lots of ways to hasten death and to do it in a way that the person is potentially as comfortable as possible. It has one statement about hospice and palliative care. One. That whole industry has really changed, improved. Again, we don't have it everywhere, but where it's available, the statement should say more about that and should say more about how that can be a beneficial option and what that can look like. We have had changes in medical technology. You know, Jack was referring to respirators, and we can extend life even longer than we could 30 years ago in ways that aren't probably any more beneficial. So again, those kinds of things need to be talked about. There's been a lot of change in medical aid and dying since that time in terms of its adoption, and I've already talked about how I'm not sure there's much difference between that as a choice as compared to other ways in which we can substantially hasten our deaths that the church considers morally acceptable. The church's own statement on abortion arguably is saying it's morally acceptable to choose to end a life, and yet here they're saying no. Again, I'm not saying, yeah, MAID is the greatest thing. I just think it's time to reconsider this. We oppose it under any circumstances. I do think, in particular, again, this strong emphasis, which I completely agree with, on the dignity of each person and the points that you're making. My body, my choice, including when I decide before I become incompetent, my choice. That is already emphasized. It probably could be further emphasized. And as a result, I'm not sure why the church is saying yes to some things that hasten death and no to other options. So that's what I have in my message, but it needs to be shorter. So which of these would you think are less important to emphasize, or what do you think is really key to why the church should reconsider its current social message? Rita and then Jack.
Where do you go from that to your two and a
Well, see, you have to start out with whereas, and then you have to talk about the item. So here's an example. Whereas in the social statement on abortion, the church recognizes that under some circumstances, ending a pregnancy is a morally responsible decision and writes, you know what I mean? So yeah, maybe I could just make them all shorter.
Yeah.
That's an idea. Yeah. Oh, yes, Jack.
I would think about adding something that the
Oh, good. Let's add stuff. No, please, go ahead,
yeah,
Jack.
but this will allow us
Solar
to
press.
subtract some things. I would think about having the church say, we recommend that you identify an advocate for your wishes.
That's a good
Because I
point.
can't overemphasize how hard this is if you run into some, well, this nursing home in Kansas. She
Right.
needs an advocate
Right.
that's there with her to remind everybody that I don't want to die from choking on peas.
Right.
I'll
Yeah.
tell a personal story. When I brush my teeth in the morning, I hit my tongue real hard with the toothbrush to keep my gag reflex active because I don't want to die full of peas in my lungs when I'm in a nursing home.
That would be isn't that an image?
Because I've seen it. I
Do
have
not
seen
want
it.
to choke on peas.
But I think you could. I think you could maybe somehow
Yeah.
say your pastor or somebody from the church could
Yeah.
be your advocate.
Yeah.
Because family members aren't always up to it.
No.
And you really got to make your wishes clear. I don't want CPR under
Yeah.
any circumstances. A lady in Iowa had it tattooed across her chest, and the powers that be said that wasn't official enough.
It's not signed by two people, so
Yeah.
don't pay attention to my tattoo. Okay.
But the advocacy, I think, would be
Yeah.
important.
Yes.
That's why it's important to pick someone as your health
Care, correct. Yes.
that will
Yes.
have the spine to
Yes.
stand up and say,
Yes.
And let them know that they're on your form.
Yes.
Let them
Yes.
know that.
No, I think that's so in your health care directive, you have your primary and your secondary. First of all, do not make them co's. That's the worst. Co-people. Because then they have to agree. Don't think, well, I have 3 children, so I'm going to make them co-equal. This is a really bad idea. So you pick one person for your number 1 and then your number 2. And Chris is exactly right. You want somebody who does not have any problem standing up to somebody else. That's right. Even when they're stubborn.
So can I just add?
Yes, of course.
So 30 plus years ago, my mother died of she did not have an advance directive, and because she was 57, and she had a massive lung cancer. Is that on? Oh, is it? Are we on?
You have to talk really close
Okay.
into it.
Is
There.
that on now?
Yeah, it's
There
on.
we go.
Yeah.
So in any case, my dad calls me. I go to La Crosse, and she's in the hospital. And of course, there's nothing written down and on a ventilator. So now she's on the
Oh
vent.
my gosh.
And so I'm like you, I'm a pretty force of
Oh,
nature.
yeah.
So I walk in there and I'm like, we need to get her off the vent.
Yeah.
Like now.
Yeah.
I would also add that because she's 57, she does not have Medicare, and my parents had no health
No money.
insurance.
No. Oh, no health
So
insurance.
the meter is ticking, right? It's like the
Oh.
cab. And my dad has no money.
Yeah.
So I'm like advocate, and they're like, well, they paralyzed her because she was fighting the vent. I said,
Oh my gosh.
okay, well, let's stop the Versed. Or, yeah, that's what they had her.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we really don't know what your mom thought. I'm like, I know what my mom thought. She does not want to be ventilated. I mean, we were like toe to toe. I made him go back there, and like, I'm a doctor, and I know what I'm doing.
Sure.
I look at these
Sure.
x-rays, I look at her brain, I look at her liver. I'm like, she is not going to survive this.
Right, right.
Well, the long and the short of it is we came to an agreement. Friday morning, they agreed if she had not woken up, they would pull the
Okay.
they would pull the vent. They pulled the vent, and then she died Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, this, and he couldn't come because
Right.
no one would take call for him. I'm there by myself with 3 little kids, or I was pregnant. I was pregnant with Kari. And it was really a difficult situation. So if you can avoid that, A, for yourself
Right,
and
right.
for your children,
Yeah.
it's the greatest gift
Right,
that you can
right.
give your family.
Rain has a comment.
Yes, for people who don't have families
Right.
or really close people,
Right.
you can have your if you trust your doctor.
Yeah.
And especially in Minnesota, some states aren't connected to each other within the medical thing, but you have your primary doctor or the doctor you trust or whatever on the thing. They can make the decisions
Yes.
for you.
Yes.
And it's on file.
Yes, you can do that.
Yep.
That's a, yeah, in the health
If
care
you have a good
declaration.
doctor,
Yeah.
they'll look through it
Yes,
too,
they will look through it with you. That, I
right
think
before they agree.
that's a really good point, that, you know, Clark and I don't have kids. I mean, we have nieces and nephews and people, I think, who love us. But I don't know that I would want to put this on them. So why not a doctor?
Both of you are in an accident.
Exactly, together. Exactly. So
If you have a good doctor,
that's an excellent point, having, yeah. Well, if it's in your file, yeah.
I'm going to caution you. It's very well known that if you come rolling into the emergency room and you aren't breathing, you're going to be put on a ventilator no matter what your family says or what your paper says. No ER doc is going to say, well, it says in this paper that we shouldn't ventilate. There's a great fear out there of being sued, and there's a great fear out there about people changing their mind. And so the momentum of the medical community is let's do everything first and then reevaluate when the smoke settles. So I know of cases where little old ladies, and I mean that in a good way, came in from the nursing home, blue, 95 years old, can't get a hold of her paperwork, don't know where the next of kin is, boom, on the ventilator, and we'll deal with it in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, nothing's, well, I shouldn't say, well, nothing is perfect. I mean, so all we can do in this case, and again, do the best you can. But let me ask this general question. Do you agree with me that we should update this 1992? Yes. Okay, agreement. People agree with that. John?
How close does the Florida Bahamas memorial fit what you were trying to say?
Well, first of all, their memorial is like a half a page. So they've gotten the brevity really well. And essentially it says, you need to reconsider 1992, and especially medical aid in dying. That's all it says. So, and I have to, what I have learned though, and the reason why this probably doesn't need to be so long, is the bishop of the St. Paul Synod has already said, yeah, we will definitely support this. So it'll get through our synod. And then that's a question of what happens at the wider ELCA. And apparently all of your whereases are not considered necessarily by the group that convenes to update the statement. So I might have brilliant suggestions, but you know, into the trash heap. So from that perspective, all I need to say is enough for them to say, yes, we're going to reconsider this statement and offer new and better guidance. But I do like the idea of maybe focusing in particular that they really say a lot more about hospice and palliative care and a lot more about the need for the community, including that advocate, so that people, in fact, get what they need. Chris.
One way to condense that is to say since 1992, there have been many changes, including growth in hospice and palliative care and medical technology.
Yeah. And just combining that.
And legislation.
Yes, and legislation.
And it provides a lot of choices for people. And maybe like the voluntary cessation of eating and drinking, no hand feeding. You don't have to spell all that out, but there are a lot of choices that allow for, that promote comfort in dying.
Yes, comfort in dying. Spike. Yeah, and just take that out. Yeah. Yes. No, I think that's, yeah, it's just, it's not necessary, not helpful. Yeah.
As far as protocol goes, when this gets brought to the conference initially, and then it goes to the synod, each of those times, the person or the church or the small group or whatever that's bringing it to, does get time to talk in presentation. So you can maybe, and also get an opportunity to ask questions and have discussion. So some of the more detailed stuff, you could probably bring up then.
Sure.
Without having it written up there.
That's a good point.
Because when we vote on these things, oftentimes the bishop will say, there's a lot of the whereas, whatever, what we're really voting on is this part here. And so.
Yeah, they're simply voting on reconsidering the statement. They're not voting on, we're going to put all this stuff in it. Yeah.
And I would add that demographically, we're aging as a
Yeah.
society. We were always told that from 2010 to 2030, the number of 80-year-olds was going to double.
Which causes us to be a lot more interested in this. Yeah.
It sounds like we need council approval of this.
No, we don't. We don't need council approval. All we need is a church, us, who think it's a good idea.
And having this conversation is actually.
Exactly.
Probably better than having a council.
Yeah.
Because there's more of you here.
Right.
And we're having the conversation.
Yes.
And you've been given the information and you can continue the conversation.
Right. Bob?
We have to leave.
Yes.
I just want to say, Claudia, thank you very, very
You're so welcome. You're so welcome. And thank you all for being here and for all your great discussion. Yes, Chris?
Can that be on the website?
Yes. Yeah. Or I can just send it to Penny and she can send it out to you if you want it.
I have it.
Yeah, you can forward it.
Just send her whole thing.
Yeah.
As well as you can watch again. Unfortunately, it cuts off in about quarter two. I still need to talk to somebody to see if we can extend it. But yes, I can get that all sent out if you are on that email that I send, and if you aren't, you'll want to be, let me know.
Again, thank you so much.
Comments, Claudia, this has been fabulous.
And next week, Chris.
And then Chris is going to have more. And also, thank you, those of you who have experience
Yes.
in the palliative care, in the hospice care. Your knowledge and care in this area is fabulous, and I hope you can come next week, too, to be a part of that conversation.
So Penny, can you get this off me? I forever will be Mike.
There you go. Yeah, this was fabulous. Good. And you just do such a great job with your presentation. You're so clear.
Timing. I've looked, I was on the Reconciliation and Council Committee. The date for the Senate
Is the February.
is, for the Senate,
Oh, May.
is March 28th.
No.
For the Senate is March 28th. I got it from the assistant to the bishop this week.
Yeah.
I got the actual date. The Senate,
Yeah.
Senate.
Yeah.
Oh, the
St. Paul
Senate.
There's a
The
difference.
Senate.
I'm talking Senate.
SENAT.
No,
S-Y-N-O-D.
the St. Paul Synod. He's correct.
So that's March.
It
Now,
simply needs to get through the conference before
I don't even
that
think
date.
it has to go through the conference.
Well, probably
yeah, it-
doesn't. It's their preferred.
Yeah, but according to what
Yeah.
the assistant to the bishop
Yeah.
sent me, because
Yeah.
I was trying to make sure, if to that point, does the council have to weigh in or
Yeah.
what?
Yeah.
And it's really ambiguous.
It is ambiguous.
And she sent, what she sent me was, it need to come from a conference
Yes,
or through the Senate. It doesn't necessarily have to start with a conference.
that's true.
So I don't know, the reason I'm bringing that up,
Yeah.
I would suspect the timeline, the deadline for the conference,
That's February.
I know May already,
No.
for submitting it.
I've already submitted.
Okay, you already
So
done it.
I went I sent her my draft, and I
Okay.
said that I would be discussing it, and I would be updating it. So it's
Okay.
on the agenda
So
for
you
the
already got
conference.
timeline then, but, yeah, but the.
But I appreciate
March,
that.
March 28th is the
Yes.
Senate deadline.
Yes.
And it's, as you know,
Okay.
because you've seen them,
Yes,
they need to be just.
I know.
Just
Much
reconsider,
shorter.
just reconsider, boom, boom, boom.
So
whereas
that's the
we're-
deadline to
and-
get it submitted
And
is
then,
March.
Correct.
and then, as you know, you can spend
Oh, yeah.
forever
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about it.
What it's gonna be.
But I
So
just,
thank you for that.
you know, we had 45 people here.
Yeah.
So if that's of any bit of
That's awesome.
information when you present at conference.
And I am going to talk to the council
Oh, thank you.
this
Thank you.
coming
Sure.
Monday about this,
Yes,
because
good. So they know.
nobody else was here.
Yes, no.
So that they're aware.
So they're aware.
And if I can get that from you, I'll be able to just say,
He's not on your list, he told me.
Oh, I'll just forward it to you, John. I'll take care of that.
Well, if you want to be on my list, you need to give me your email.
it's pretty simple.
Trudy.
Yes.
Are
You
you
know what
ready?
happened to Trudy?
No,
Why she
It's
left?
just like mine, John
So
Hodler at,
the reason she left.
it's just John
So
Hodler?
she has a son.
gmail.com.
You probably know
Okay.
that.
there's not too many of them.
And she felt that, and she really wanted him to have community. And she apparently talked to Pastor Peter in particular and said, you know, after kids get out of confirmation, there's the one high school thing, but there's sort of nothing here for young adults, 20-ish.
I kind of remember her mentioning that.
And she was very discouraged by the lack of willingness to respond to her concern. And so she's not worshiping anywhere. She didn't go to any other
In the
church.
area?
She is. She lives over, she lives in an apartment in Stillwater. Yeah. So I see her because we use her for gardening and cleaning and a host of services.
I know she did so many
Is
different
that
things.
Trudy's?
That's true, yeah.
She did so many different things.
Yeah, so she's,
She used to
working
go out to
full-time.
breakfast with us, you know,
I
and
did not know that.
and so all of a sudden she was gone and we didn't know it.
Well, and I tried reaching out to her and I didn't ever hear back from her.
Did you have her phone number?
I had her email.
She doesn't, I'll send you her phone number. I always text and call her.
Because,
She
yeah,
rarely responds to
because
emails.
I sent her a number of emails and I was like, well,
No,
what the
I would
heck?
text her and
Okay.
call her. But that was basically, she got very discouraged by
Yes.
that. And then she decided, you know, if there wasn't anything here for her son, she was just gonna chuck it. So it's too bad. If you want me to, I'll send you her number too. I'm sure she would love to have you reach out to her.
Okay.
I mean, she had no issue with people.
Yeah.
It was just,
She could join us for breakfast sometime.
of course, I'm sure
So I
she'd
will
love that.
invite her.
So I'll send you her,
Yeah, my
Yeah.
name's in the directory.
I will.
Okay?
So you're
Sounds
hiding
good.
it.
Thank you.
I mean, let's put it this way. We both have strong opinions, and we listen to each other.
You have good conversation.
You don't always agree.
Thank you for joining us. I made a point to come today, although I think I know all this stuff, you know, because, for support, you know, because this is such a death-denying
It
society.
is a death-denying
Like
society.
I'll say to my doctor, you know, I'm losing a lot of cognitive stuff. Oh, no, there's nothing wrong with you. Your mind's sharper than most 20-year-olds. I mean, what the heck?
I know, we don't tell the truth about this. We don't, and God created death. This is a part of life. It's a part of the process. So yes, we just so death deny, totally.
Yeah, and then, in fact, isn't this the first time we've done this at this church? That's what I thought, because I've been going here 16 years and I never noticed it. I try to go to some of these, but I'm so deaf now that I don't. I did hear most of today's, which, in spite of not having my I brought my new hearing assist along because I couldn't find my old one. And it
inside, but I use it to get in and out places. And with
Out of the car.
yeah, and the snow and ice, and this was actually the first time I actually went